The first time they saw her, she didn't look like much. Just a slim woman with a steady stare, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and boots that had clearly seen more dust than polish. The men around the campfire, grizzled soldiers, scarred and sure of themselves, exchanged smirks when she introduced herself. "Call me Medic," she said simply, setting her bag down beside the colonel's tent. Someone snorted. Another muttered, "Cute nickname," but she didn't flinch. She just gave a quiet nod like she'd heard it all before. It was an army camp in the middle of nowhere, burnt hills, the smell of diesel and gun oil in the air, the steady drone of insects too stubborn to die. The men were exhausted, jumpy, and proud. They didn't trust new faces easily, especially not someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a med school brochure instead of a war zone. "Call you Medic?" Sergeant Dorsey had laughed. "Sure thing, sweetheart. Maybe after you patch up a paper cut." But she only smiled faintly, like she knew something he didn't. "You'll see," she said. That night, when the wind howled across the barren fields and the perimeter lights flickered, something in the air changed. The colonel, an old war dog named Harlan Briggs, was sitting with his men, sharing bad coffee and worse stories. When the first distant crack echoed across the valley, a gunshot, then another. The laughter died instantly. Within seconds, chaos rolled in like a storm. The camp lights went black. Shouts cut through the darkness. Men scrambled for rifles, tripping over sandbags and shouting orders. Briggs was up, yelling for his men to take cover, when a blast split the night open, sharp, bright, and deafening. The explosion threw him backward, slamming him against a truck. By the time the smoke began to clear, Briggs was down. Medic was already moving. No hesitation, no waiting for the all clear. She dropped beside him, hands already tearing open her bag while bullets still whistled past the tents. "Stay with me," she murmured, voice calm as water. Her fingers pressed into the colonel's neck, finding a pulse weak and fluttering. Dorsey was crouched nearby, trying to reload. "He's hit bad. We need a chopper." "No time," Medic said. "He's bleeding out now." She didn't shout. She didn't panic. Her tone was sharp enough to slice through the noise. She tore open Briggs's vest, revealing a jagged piece of metal buried deep near his ribs. The sight made even the toughest men flinch. "You can't," Dorsey started. "I can," she said, "and I will." She had no surgical tools, no light, no sterile field, just her bare hands, a flashlight between her teeth, and a bag of supplies that looked too small to save anyone. But her movements were precise, efficient. She pressed her hands over the wound, then reached in with a confidence that made Dorsey's stomach twist. "Jesus," someone whispered. Her eyes flicked up. "Not yet," she said around the flashlight. "He's still got a fight left." For 20 minutes, the world shrank to the sound of gunfire, labored breathing, and the rhythm of her voice. She talked to Briggs the whole time, her words steady, anchoring him to the world. "You ever been to Clearwater Beach, Colonel? White sand, blue water. You're buying me a drink there when we get back." She found the shard, pulled it free, and clamped the artery with her fingers before he could bleed out. Blood coated her arms to the elbow, but her eyes never wavered. When she was done, she tied off the wound with strips from her own shirt, then pressed down until the bleeding stopped. Only then did she let out a breath and whisper, "You're safe now, sir." By dawn, Briggs was still alive, pale, weak, but breathing. When the medevac finally arrived hours later, the flight medic blinked in disbelief. "He shouldn't be alive," he said. Medic just shrugged. "Don't tell him that. He'll start asking for a medal." No one laughed this time. Not a sound. Later that morning, as the sun burned over the broken ridges, Dorsey approached her quietly. His voice had none of the mockery from the night before. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. She was sitting alone, cleaning her hands with a rag that used to be white. She didn't look up. "Some things you learn the hard way," she said. He hesitated. "You weren't Army, were you?" She looked at him then, eyes distant but sharp. "I was once." There was something in her tone, loss, maybe, or guilt, that made him stop asking. For the rest of the week, the men treated her differently. They stopped calling her sweetheart, stopped smirking when she spoke. They listened. She patched their wounds, cleaned their gear, fixed a torn boot with a sewing kit she carried like treasure. She became part of them, though she never tried to be. At night, when the campfire crackled low and the desert turned cold, the soldiers sometimes watched her stare at the horizon, fingers tracing the dog tag she wore on a chain under her shirt. The name was too worn to read. One night, Dorsey asked her what it said. She didn't answer for a while. Then softly, "It used to say Captain Mara Ellison." He frowned. "Captain? You mean?" She nodded. "Medical Corps. 5 years ago." Dorsey leaned forward. "What happened?" Mara's eyes were far away. "A convoy got ambushed. Too many wounded. Not enough of us to go around. I saved who I could." She paused. "But not him. Your CO." She looked down at the tag, thumb brushing the faded metal. "My husband." Silence settled heavy between them. Dorsey swallowed. "And you came back?" Her lips curved into a small, sad smile. "I came where I was needed." The next day the colonel woke. His first words were hoarse but clear. "Where's the medic?" They brought her in. He tried to sit up but couldn't. His face was pale, streaked with pain, but his eyes lit with something fierce when he saw her. You saved my life." She shrugged again. "You did the hard part, sir. You stayed alive." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a groan. "You're not regulation, are you?" She smiled. "Never was." But then, before she could say more, the radio crackled. Static, then a voice. "Urgent. We've got movement. South Ridge. Multiple hostiles." The colonel cursed under his breath. "They're coming again?" Mara was already grabbing her kit. "Looks like we're not done yet." Dorsey looked at her. "You can't go out there again. You just..." She met his gaze. "If your men go, I go." And before anyone could stop her, she was out the tent flap, the morning sun blazing off her blood-stained sleeves. The sound of gunfire rose again, echoing across the valley. That was when they realized something strange, how she seemed to move without fear, how she ran toward danger instead of away from it, how her instincts were too sharp to be just training. Something about her didn't fit. Someone whispered, "You think she's..." Dorsey shook his head. "I don't know what she is, but she's the reason we're all still breathing." That day, the camp would face something worse than a firefight, something no one expected, and before it was over, every man there would understand why she said, "Call me, medic." The morning sun burned high over the hills as the attack came harder than before. Dust clouds rolled across the camp. Bullets tore through sandbags and the air turned thick with the metallic sting of fear. Mara, medic, moved like a ghost between the chaos. She darted from man to man, patching wounds, shouting orders, dragging the wounded out of the open while gunfire cracked above her head. The others barely noticed she wasn't wearing armor anymore. She'd tossed it aside hours ago when it started slowing her down. "Medic!" Dorsey shouted from the barricade. "We've got 2 down near the truck." "On it," she called back, sprinting low, her boots skidding in the dirt. When she reached them, one soldier was bleeding from a neck wound, the other unconscious. Her hands worked fast, her voice steady as she clamped, pressed, tied. The gunfire around her faded into background noise, like her mind had built a wall against panic. Her heart thudded in rhythm with the pulse beneath her fingers. Life fragile but present. Then came a different sound. A low whine. A drone. She froze, head snapping up. A shadow swept over them, followed by a deafening explosion. The truck erupted in a ball of flame that sent bodies flying. Mara hit the ground hard, her ears ringing, smoke filling her lungs. When she pushed herself up, coughing, the camp was chaos again, men screaming, fire eating through tents, ammo boxes cooking off one by one. Through the smoke, she saw the colonel's stretcher overturned. He was gone. Her pulse spiked. Colonel Briggs. No answer. She ran, searching through the haze, the noise, the blur of movement. Finally, near the ridge, she saw him dragging himself toward a half-collapsed wall. Blood seeping through his bandages. She sprinted to him and slid to her knees. "Sir, you can't move." He looked up, face pale but defiant. "They're flanking from the south. We can't hold much longer." She glanced toward the horizon. He was right. Enemy troops were advancing, dark shapes against the light, moving fast. "Where's command?" she demanded. "Radio's dead. We're on our own." Her mind raced. The supply truck still had a fuel cell, enough to create a diversion, but also enough to blow half the valley sky high. She met the colonel's gaze. "Can you still give an order?" He frowned. "What are you planning?" "Buying you time," she said, standing up. "Medic, no." But she was already running. The men shouted after her, but she didn't stop. Her body ached, her lungs screamed, but she didn't slow. She reached the burning truck, wrenched open the door, and crawled inside. The heat was unbearable. The steering column was melted, the dashboard half gone, but the ignition unit was intact. She tore a flare from her belt, jammed it against the leaking fuel line, and whispered, "For you, Captain." Then she jumped clear. The explosion ripped through the camp like thunder, shaking the ground and blinding everyone for a moment. Fire roared up in a pillar that sent shock waves across the ridge. The enemy formation shattered, men stumbling, yelling, breaking apart in confusion. The soldiers took their chance. Dorsey rallied them with a roar, charging forward and driving the attackers back. Within minutes, the camp was holding again, battered but alive. When the dust began to settle, Dorsey looked around, chest heaving. "Where's Medic?" No one answered. He ran toward the flames, calling her name, eyes burning from smoke and fear. He found her lying beside the wreckage, her face streaked with soot, her body still. For a terrible moment, he thought she was gone. Then she coughed, weak, but alive. He dropped beside her, laughing and crying all at once. "You're insane," he said. She gave a faint smile. "You're welcome." The colonel was carried over soon after, still alive, thanks to her earlier work. When he saw her, his eyes filled. You saved us all." She shook her head, voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir, you saved yourselves. I just reminded you how." For a long time, no one spoke. The fire crackled, the wind shifted, and the men who had once laughed at her stood in silence. When the evac chopper finally arrived, she refused the first seat. "Get the wounded out first," she said. Dorsey frowned. "You're wounded, too." She looked down at the burns on her arms, the blood still seeping from her shoulder. "I'll live." He started to argue, but she gave him a look that ended it. Hours later, when the camp was quiet again, and the last of the smoke drifted away, Briggs called her over. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "I'll see to it that you're recommended for commendation, Captain." She froze. He smiled faintly. "Yes, I know who you are, Mara Ellison. The report said you were gone." She looked away. "I was. At least part of me was." He nodded slowly. "Well, that part came back when we needed her most." She didn't answer, just stood there watching the sun dip behind the hills, her dog tag glinting faintly in the fading light. When the chopper came back for her, she turned to Dorsey and the others. "Take care of each other," she said. Dorsey's voice cracked. "You coming back?" She hesitated. Then, with a faint smile, "You never know, someone's got to keep you boys in one piece." The blades whirred, dust rising around her, and in a moment she was gone. Just a silhouette lifting into the golden sky, the tag at her neck catching the last light of day. Months later, when the colonel recovered, he made sure her story was written into the record. But there was something odd. No trace of her name appeared in any official file. The medical corps had no record of a Captain Mara Ellison still active or even alive. And yet, now and then, soldiers in distant outposts swore they'd seen her. A lone medic arriving out of nowhere, saving lives where all hope was lost, vanishing before dawn. They'd tell her story by campfires, their voices hushed and reverent. They laughed when she said, "Call me medic," they'd say, but they weren't laughing when she saved the colonel with her bare hands. And maybe, somewhere out there under another burning sky, she was still walking toward the sound of gunfire, bag in hand, eyes steady and fearless, because some people don't need medals or ranks or records to matter. Some just need to save one more life before they rest. In the end, that was her story. A story about courage without recognition, faith without witnesses, and a woman who turned her pain into purpose. And if you ever hear someone say, "Call me medic," you'd better believe her.